Greetings, my friends, and welcome back to Tales from DS-106, where today we're going to look at a delectable tale of love and death called Last Respects.
Meaty indeed.
Yeah.
So, a couple of things about this tale. Uh, Immediately, I like the way, and this to me speaks a little bit to storytelling and story structuring. I like the way this tale frames itself. You have this guy walking into a cemetery looking for, a particular, whether it be a grave or a mausoleum. He doesn't know. It turns out it's a mausoleum, and he gets there. All the while, I got to find you. And then once he gets there, you still have no idea. You know someone's probably dead, and he's going to find them, but you don't know if it's a zombie. You don't know what's going to happen. But then, and that's the first page or two, but then it introduces you to a flashback to fill in the details that you're now wanting. And, flashback is a powerful tool because it allows you, if you get someone hooked on your tale, on your story, it allows you to have so much fun filling in those details and then bringing them back in to the present, which is exactly what this story does. And I think it's really effective at that. The structure of Last Respects is something that's not necessarily revolutionary, but I think it's actually really well done, and it's a great example of how to use flashback to some effect to keep actually the setting pretty simple. It's a cemetery, and he's going to a casket to talk to his dead beloved. But then it allows him to fill in with a kind of more, here's what happened, and then return to the story to finish it off, so to speak. So I really love the form and structure of this story.
Yeah. It starts you off with a mystery and lets you dig into it, whereas if it presented everything linearly, you're losing a lot of the surprise.
Yeah, and a lot of the caring, because there's also a hook effect here.
Yeah. There's an interesting design thing that goes on in here. Like one of the hallmarks, like an identifying characteristic of a comic book is the speech bubble. And then we have the captions as well. And you notice how the speech bubbles, they have that ghostly shape, the jagged or dripping edges on the captions.
Yeah.
As opposed to normally they're smooth curves, straight lines. So it gives it that sort of like creepy horror type effect. But it's, there's a subtlety to it, I guess, as much as you can have in a comic book.
Yeah, exactly.
And when it switches to the flashback scene, then it's more normal.
Huh. Yeah, I didn't pick up on that. That's nice. Yeah, it gets a lot straighter lines, right? As soon as they go.
Yeah. It's sort of, I guess, in a comic book, it actually shows you what sounds sound like, and that sort of like dripping speech bubble sort of adds that, dread or fear or sense of emotion to it, I guess.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Because the mausoleum, the cemetery, you name it, is it's a classic setting for this, and this comic does a fine job of setting it up. Nothing particularly crazy, but the flashback is interesting because the flashback obviously puts you in a completely different world, but it also starts to showcase, okay, what is this story about? And again, it's what I kind of like about the EC Comics is it's nothing too insane. Like, it's an illicit love affair between a chauffeur and the rich niece of the niece of the rich uncle, and it's an illicit affair, which means if the uncle finds out, they're both screwed, and that's the tension. Right? The tension's built into the relationship. And so here they are. We see him in a carnival. Everything looks fine. You know, he wins this creepy squirrel-like thing that we don't know, but that's what he's coming to bring her. And it's got these weird, like, almost like sports glasses on. I don't even know how to describe them. Oakley's.
Oh, like driving goggles, maybe.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
A squirrel with driving goggles. And then you find out as the date's coming to a close and they're outside the car, that he's her chauffeur. And that this is something that we don't. Now, that seems to tension, but there's a little other tension that's completely downplayed in this comic, which I think might be a sign of the times. I don't know. Is that she's underage.
Yeah.
And like, that's used as a reason why the uncle could force them to get an annulment because they've gotten married. But the whole idea is that, you know, she's underage is not complicated at all in the 50s. It's just used as a way for the uncle to break their marriage. Now, I don't know if this is true across the 50s, but I just thought it was interesting. Sorry. I just thought it was interesting that they did kind of highlight that fact, not as an issue for the audience, but as a kind of almost a caveat that the uncle could use to break up their marriage. Because otherwise, they're married, that's fine. They could leave. You know, if they love each other, the money shouldn't matter. But they can't because she's underage. But that's a whole other issue.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's saying that they don't actually have control over their lives, right?
Yeah.
And that's, again, there's a level of discomfort, fear in that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, nothing could be more, you know, I don't know. It's, again, you said it, you know, not only the rich uncle who has control, and that's a theme, but also the economics, right? The class relationships, you know.
Yeah,
She,
right.
with this, you know, strapping butler or chauffeur. It's interesting.
Yeah.
One of the things I like about this chauffeur, though, is that he smokes a pipe. So he himself is forcing or complicating some of our associations of class, you know, because I, in my mind, always associate a pipe with an upper class kind of literary figure. And here we have maybe a really literary chauffeur, right? Like, I don't know. I mean, that whole class thing can be very simplified, obviously, according to tropes. But here's a trope that doesn't work.
Yeah.
At least for us in our day and age.
Yeah. Yeah, so the rich uncle, he's stopping the marriage. Google is giving me trouble because it wants me to download an app.
Hello.
That's pinging on your end, but it's showing on mine.
Alphabet.
Yeah. So she stops it. The girl goes into some depression, decline, and she dies.
Yeah. She dies for love.
She dies. And in the very same panel where it's mentioned that she died, Tony here mentions that he just killed her uncle. Like, I guess there's a whole story in there that we just missed. The transition from caption to speech bubble. Maybe they left it out in terms of space. Maybe they just didn't think it was important. I don't know. But it's an interesting little, this is really annoying me.
Yeah, it doesn't. I mean, the thing is, there's no transition. He's back. So we have the moment where he's back now, right? So there's the great kind of, there's the flashback, and there's the structure of that. And it's great. It works. And then we go back, and it's like Tony sitting there. I killed your uncle, so now we're together. And, you know, basically he gives you the stuffed animal. He can't, he's trying to lift the casket, but can't. Or, you know, what is it? What would you call it? Yeah, the casket. Can't get the cap off. So he basically is leaving the stuffed animal, right? Ready to go.
Yeah. Yeah. But he's not going to go because the door blew shut and he's stuck there.
Another great trope.
Trapped.
They're all tropes. It's great.
Yeah, right. Like, that being buried alive type thing is going on there.
And that's another one that comes again and again, is the buried alive. A little bit less horrific to be buried alive in a mausoleum than a casket underground,
Right.
but still
Yeah.
pretty horrific.
Yeah. I mean, he's mentioning there he's going to starve,
Yeah.
you know.
But he does have water. So we know, like, the comic gives it to you, right? There's some water that's leaking in. And so, like, he could sustain himself on some water, right?
Right. Yeah.
There is a question.
Yeah. So it's mentioned there that he was there day through night. How long is he there? A week?
He was there for
2 weeks? A month?
almost
Pounding, trying. Yeah, but almost a month later.
a month. I think a week went by, and every day the knocking, the hammering continued, right? And then 2 weeks, the pounding was becoming fainter, but Tony was still alive. Then, almost a month later, so a full month, the beating and the calling stopped. Now, we know as humans, right, we can live like about a week or so without water, 10 days, but, a week or so without food,
Yeah.
or 10 days without food. But only, like, if we don't have water,
Yeah.
we can't live a couple of days, right?
Right.
So he lives a month. How is that
Yeah.
possible?
Yeah. And the engraver shows up. There's the chauffeur. We've been looking for him.
That's right.
He's only been dead a day or so.
But what's bones around him?
Oh.
Hey,
And that's
this coffin's pried open. Oh, it's awesome.
and that's where our story goes from horror to revulsion.
Yes. From
What's
zero
the
to
step below that? No.
And I think it was always like, walking the thin line of horror. It was kind of horror, but not really horrific.
Yeah.
But then it's like, this guy must have been trapped in here. He stayed alive by catching water in this urn. ...
Yeah.
And then the other guy says, and eating. Oh, God, no.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. So why did he die? Well,
Cannibal. I mean, cannibalism is absolutely. It's like the hallmark of revulsion.
yeah.
Humanity, right?
Right. But, he died from formaldehyde poisoning. So he'll be preserved.
That's what kills him. Yeah, I mean, it's a crazy story. I mean, in
Yeah.
terms of like, but what it also does is it highlights too a kind of the arc for a lot of these EC comics is they're based on, the Shyamalaya kind of like twist. Many of them depend upon that twist. We also see this, and you'll see this in Twilight Zone. And many of the stories that we watch in these kind of small tales, even The Hook, when Stephen King talked about it, it's all about that twist at the end, right? And these are horrific and terrifying stories, and often there's the horror and terror is framed into kind of the fabric of the story. But the twist is kind of a way to resolve it, a way to kind of like maybe shock you quickly, get you to that kind of revulsion in there, and then move on. But the twist you remember to some degree, but it's the feeling and the horror and the sense.
Yeah.
I think this story in particular is probably, the twist is greater than anything else it could create by its atmosphere. So it's unique in that, it is based on a twist.
The twist like hits you with a sledgehammer, basically.
You're not seeing it. They're setting you up for it subtly, like with the water and everything. Like they're trying to and it's been weeks and then it's a month and you're like, a month, but it still doesn't register. And then they come in and they say, what about all those bones around them? And then you're like, oh no, finger licking good. Right? And you're like, this is upsetting.
Yeah. And the old witch, she
Doesn't lose the chance for a zinger.
she just digs it in deeper. A meaty little choke up,
Exactly.
Give
Immediately.
you another tail to chew on.
Exactly. And one of the things I thought about with this, and then another pot of putrescence. I mean, there's that just great. cheesy alliteration. But one of the things I thought about too is like, one of the cools that it's called Tales from the Crypt. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But also this idea of spinning tales, of telling tales, of like the idea of like it goes back to the beginning of humanity's kind of communication devices, I imagine, to some degree. But like even our notions of like the Canterbury Tales and like this idea of people sitting around telling each other stories to entertain, to scare, to pass the time, to kind of share our culture, Homer, you name it. Like, there's a rich tradition, and it's funny how that tradition in comics might be understood, at least the EC comics are a real focal point in a moment where, pop culture wasn't taken very significantly. Like you had real culture, and then you had this kind of kid culture almost. And it's funny how, 50, 60 years later, we're reading that kid culture with great attention, and maybe wrongly. But I have a feeling that there's a lot of reasons to focus on it because Edgar Allan Poe, who we've brought up a couple of times now, Edgar Allan Poe, invents in some ways a lot of the kind of, at least the particulars of a genre like this, whether it be the detective genre, but even what we understand as at least American horror. And I don't know if that's so national as that, but you know what I mean? Like this has a tradition, and it seems like the tradition by the 50s in history U.S. became a kind of kid tradition, right? Like the best of it was written into these EC comics or in these B movies that, you would go and see as a matinee or as a drive-in. So it's just interesting how the culture has shifted. And I don't know if I have a full analysis of that, but there's something there.
Yeah, it was, I don't know if it was entirely, considered kid stuff. Because, in those days, comic books were like huge, like for them to sell 1 million copies was no big deal.
Wow.
And they were big with, the military, soldiers. That was a big market for them. So, but they do play to that real.
Well, but also didn't
level, I guess.
From what I understand of the comic book self-censoring of EC was that they used the figure of the kid as the audience.
Yeah, the juvenile delinquent.
Corrupted, exactly. Which the juvenile delinquent was cast a much wider net of American culture and of our ideas of youth culture and generation culture, which we'd see and explode in the 60s, was starting to emerge. So it's interesting. I mean, there's an interesting point there too, I think, about like a generational clash around ideas of storytelling and sharing.
Yeah. The censorship thing interests me too, because it came up in the 50s with the comic books, juvenile delinquency.
Yeah.
It came up in the 80s with rap music, heavy metal music. Like the lyrics they tried to censor, and it comes back again with like video games like Grand Theft Auto and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's absolutely an ongoing theme. And it would be interesting to trace it across like video games are a perfect example, right? They often seem like youth culture, but the average gamer is in his 30s or her 30s, right? So it's like, it's very much still a tradition of people that they've had and been part of for decades. So.
Yeah. So that's our little last respects. Yeah.
Good one.
All right.
The ending. A delectable tale, as you said.
Yeah. Love and death. All right. We'll sign off here.
Absolutely.